Welcome, future psychologists, to another Uber School production. I'm Crash, and today we're diving deep into the world of assessment, evaluation, and intervention. This is a crucial part of your California psychology, law, and ethics examination, so listen up.
That's right, Crash. I'm Pete, and we're here to make sure every single one of you aces this part of the exam. We're covering everything from involuntary treatment to telehealth, so buckle up.
Let's start with a bang, Petey boy. Involuntary treatment. It's a heavy topic, but we've got to tackle it. In California, we're looking at the Lanterman-Petrus-Short Act. This bad boy governs the 5,150 and 5,250 holds, as well as conservatorship. But don't forget, we've also got to keep an eye on federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act.
Absolutely, Crasher. And let's not forget the ethical tightrope we're walking here. On one side, we've got patient autonomy, letting people make their own choices. On the other, we've got professional beneficence, doing what's best for the patient. It's like trying to balance on a tightrope while juggling flaming torches.
Great analogy, Pete. Now here's a key point for our Uber School students. Always, and I mean always, go for the least restrictive alternative. Exhaust all voluntary options before you even think about involuntary measures. It's like bow hunting. You don't just charge in and hope for the best. You plan, you prepare, and you make sure you're taking the right shot.
Speaking of taking the right shot, let's talk about clinical assessment for involuntary treatment. We're looking at two main areas here: danger to self or others and grave disability. You've got to evaluate suicidal or homicidal ideation, self-harm behaviors, and whether the person can provide for their basic needs.
Right you are, Petey. And now it's time for our first Uber School USMLE style question. Are you ready, future docs?
Hit 'em with it, Crash.
All right, here we go. A 35-year-old man is brought to the emergency department by police after threatening to jump off a bridge. He appears agitated and states he can't take it anymore. Which of the following is the most appropriate initial action?
Ooh, that's a tough one, Crash. What are our options?
A. Immediately initiate a 5,150 hold. B. Discharge the patient without patient follow-up. C. Perform a thorough suicide risk assessment. D. Administer antipsychotic medication. E. Contact the patient's family for collateral information.
Well, Uber School students, take a moment to think about it. Remember what we just discussed about least restrictive alternatives and thorough assessment.
Time's up. The correct answer is C. Perform a thorough suicide risk assessment. Always assess before you act, folks.
Exactly, Crash. You can't just slap a 5,150 on someone without a proper assessment. It's like trying to fix an engine without diagnosing the problem first. You might do more harm than good.
Speaking of doing harm, let's move on to our next topic, duty to protect. This is where things get real, Petey. We're talking about the landmark Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California case and Civil Code 43.92. This is the stuff that keeps psychologists up at night.
You're not kidding, Crash. This is where we have to put on our detective hats and evaluate threats. We're looking at specificity, immediacy, and severity. It's like we're profilers in a crime show, but with a lot more paperwork and ethical considerations.
And don't forget, we've got to consider historical, clinical, and contextual risk factors. It's not just about what the patient is saying right now, but their whole history and situation.
Absolutely. And when it comes to implementing that duty to protect, we might need to warn potential victims or notify law enforcement. But here's the kicker: documentation is crucial. If you don't document it, it's like it never happened.
Pete, this reminds me of a story about Marcus Cooper. Did I ever tell you about the time he single-handedly prevented a mass shooting just by talking to the would-be perpetrator?
Crash, I've heard so many Marcus Cooper stories from you, I'm not sure which ones are real anymore. But let's focus on the exam material, shall we?
Fair enough, Petey. Let's move on to psychological testing. This is where ethics really come into play. We've got to make sure our test selection is appropriate for the purpose and population. And don't forget about cultural factors.
Absolutely, Crash. Test administration and scoring need to follow standardized procedures. It's not just about giving the test, it's about giving it right. And when it comes to interpretation, we need to be integrative, looking at multiple data sources.
And let's not forget about test security and copyright compliance, Pete. We've got to keep those materials under lock and key, both physically and digitally. It's like protecting the secret recipe for your famous homemade brew.
Haha, you know it, Crash. Now how about we hit our Uber School students with another USMLE style question?
You read my mind, Petey. Here we go. A psychologist is administering the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WIIV, to a 25-year-old immigrant from China who has been living in the U.S. for 2 years. The patient struggles with some verbal subtests. What is the most appropriate action for the psychologist to take?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. What are our options, Crash?
A. Continue the test as usual and interpret the results without consideration of language barriers. B. Discontinue the test and refer the patient to a Mandarin-speaking psychologist. C. Administer only the non-verbal subtests of the WIIV. Use an interpreter to translate the verbal subtests. E. Consider the impact of language and cultural factors in test interpretation and report.
All right, Uber School students, think about what we just discussed regarding cultural factors in psychological testing.
Time's up. The correct answer is E. Consider the impact of language and cultural factors in test interpretation and report. Remember, we can't ignore these factors, but we also can't just throw out the test results.
Exactly, Crash. It's all about context and interpretation. Now, let's move on to forensic services. This is where things can get really tricky.
You're not kidding, Pete. In forensic services, we're dealing with multiple relationships and trying to maintain objectivity. It's like trying to referee a game. While playing in it, you've got to be crystal clear about your role.
Absolutely. And informed consent is crucial here. We've got to be clear about the limits of confidentiality and what we're going to do with the evaluation results. It's not like a regular therapy session. The rules are different.
And when it comes to forensic report writing, clarity is key. We need to be specific and state the factual basis for our opinions. It's not the time for flowery language or vague statements.
Right, you are, Crash. And as expert witnesses, we need to understand our role and responsibilities. It's not about being the star of the show. It's about providing clear, factual information to help the legal process.
Speaking of being clear, let's hit our Uber School students with another USMLE style question. Ready, Pete?
Fire away, Crasher.
A psychologist is asked to evaluate a defendant's competency to stand trial. During the evaluation, the defendant confesses to the crime. What is the psychologist's primary ethical obligation in this situation?
Ooh, that's a doozy. What are our options?
A. Immediately report the confession to the court. B. Keep the confession confidential. C. Inform the defendant's attorney about the confession. D. Include the confession in the forensic report. E. Encourage the defendant to confess to the court.
All right, Uber School students, think about the role of a forensic evaluator and the limits of confidentiality in this context.
Time's up. The correct answer is D. Include the confession in the forensic report. As a forensic evaluator, our primary duty is to the court, not the defendant. We need to report all relevant information, including confessions.
Exactly, Crash. It's crucial to understand the different ethical obligations in forensic versus therapeutic contexts. Now, let's move on to a topic that's becoming increasingly important, telehealth.
Telehealth, where the couch is virtual, but the therapy is real. We've got to understand the legal and regulatory framework here, Pete. We're talking licensure requirements for practicing across state lines, telehealth-specific laws at both federal and state levels. It's a whole new ballgame.
You're not kidding, Crash. And the ethical considerations are just as important. We need specific, informed consent for telehealth services, and we've got to make sure we're competent in telehealth delivery methods. It's not just about slapping a webcam on your computer and calling it a day.
Absolutely, Pete. And let's not forget about technology and security. We need to use HIPAA-compliant platforms and have robust emergency procedures in place for telehealth crises. It's like building a virtual fortress to protect our patients' privacy.
Great analogy, Crash. And clinically, we need to adapt our assessment procedures for remote administration. We also need to develop strategies to build and maintain therapeutic alliances in virtual settings. It's a whole new skill set.
You know, Pete, all this talk about virtual therapy reminds me of another Marcus Cooper story. Did you know he once conducted a group therapy session in virtual reality? The patients were so engaged they forgot they weren't in the same physical space.
Crash, I swear your Marcus Cooper stories get wilder every time. But let's focus on the exam material. How about another USMLE style question for our Uber School students?
You got it, 80. Here's a telehealth-related question. A psychologist is providing teletherapy to a patient who lives in a different state. During a session, the patient expresses suicidal ideation. What is the psychologist's most appropriate immediate action?
Ooh, this is a tough one. What are our options, Crash?
A. End the session and call 911 in the psychologist's location. B. Conduct a suicide risk assessment. C. Advise the patient to go to the nearest emergency room. D. Contact the patient's family members. E. Terminate therapy and refer the patient to a local provider.
All right, Uber School students, think about the steps we take in a crisis situation and how they might be adapted for telehealth.
Time's up. The correct answer is B. Conduct a suicide risk assessment. Just like in face-to-face therapy, we need to assess the level of risk before taking any action.
Exactly, Crash. The medium might be different, but the core principles of crisis intervention remain the same. Now let's move on to industrial/organizational services. This is where psychology meets the business world.
You're right, Pete. In IO services, we're dealing with a whole new set of ethical challenges. We've got to manage potential conflicts between individual and organizational interests. It's like being a referee in a corporate game of tug-of-war.
Great analogy, Crash, and we can't forget about balancing individual confidentiality with organizational needs. It's a delicate dance, and we need to be clear about our roles and responsibilities in organizational consultations.
Absolutely, Pete, and it's crucial to recognize the boundaries of our competence in organizational settings. We might be experts in psychology, but that doesn't automatically make us experts in every aspect of business.
You're spot on, Crash. Now let's talk about providing psychological consulting. This is where we really put our skills to the test in a variety of settings.
Right, you are, Petey. In consulting, we need to maintain clear boundaries between our consultation role and other professional roles. It's like wearing different hats, but making sure everyone knows which hat we're wearing at any given time.
And don't forget about informed consent, Crash. We need to get appropriate informed consent from all involved parties. It's not just about the individual client anymore. We might be dealing with whole organizations or systems.
Absolutely, Poot. And confidentiality in consultation can be a real challenge. We need to be careful about how we share information with other professionals. It's like playing a game of telephone, but with high stakes.
Great point, Crash. And let's not forget about proper documentation of consultation activities. If it's not written down, it didn't happen.
You know, Pete, all this talk about documentation reminds me of another Marcus Cooper story. Did you know he once wrote a 500-page consultation report in a single night? And it was so good, it won a Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction.
Crash, I'm pretty sure consultation reports aren't eligible for Pulitzer Prizes, but let's focus on the exam material. How about one last USMLE style question for our Uber School students?
You got it, Petey. Here's a question about psychological consulting. A psychologist is hired as a consultant by a large corporation to improve employee satisfaction. During the consultation, the psychologist discovers evidence of widespread discrimination. What is the most appropriate action for the psychologist to take?
Ooh, this is a tough one. What are our options, Crash?
A. Immediately report the discrimination to external authorities. B. Ignore the discrimination as it's outside the scope of the consultation. C. Confront the CEO about the discrimination. D. Include the findings in the consultation report and recommend appropriate actions. E. Quit the consultation and publicly expose the company.
All right, Uber School students, think about the role of a consultant and the ethical obligations we have in this situation.
Time's up. The correct answer is D. Include the findings in the consultation report and recommend appropriate actions. As consultants, we need to address issues we discover even if they weren't part of the original scope.
Exactly, Crash. We have an ethical obligation to report our findings and recommend actions, but we need to do it through the proper channels.
Well, Pete, we've covered a lot of ground today, from involuntary treatment to telehealth, from forensic services to psychological consulting. It's been quite a journey.
It sure has, Crash. And remember, Uber School students, the key to acing this part of the exam is understanding not just the facts, but the ethical reasoning behind them. Always consider the legal and ethical implications of your actions.
Absolutely, Pete. And don't forget to practice identifying the moral and legal implications of different situations. It's not just about knowing the rules, but about applying them in complex, real-world scenarios.
Great point, Crash. And remember, future psychologists, your goal is to provide the best possible care for your clients while adhering to legal and ethical standards. It's a challenging balance, but that's what makes this field so rewarding.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Pete. And that's a wrap for this Uber School production on assessment, evaluation, and intervention. Remember, study hard, think critically, and always strive to be the best psychologist you can be.
And don't forget to join us next time when we'll be discussing... Well, Crash, what will we be discussing next time?
Well, Pete, I was thinking we could dive into the fascinating world of neuropsychology and its applications in forensic settings. But for now, this is Crash.
And Pete.
Signing off from Uber School. Until next time, future psychologists.